Detective Harris, she said, her voice the perfect blend of authority and warning. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. The world seemed to shrink around him, the air turning thick. The crowd around them had their phones raised, recording every second, yet he barely noticed. The badge in her hand gleamed like a loaded gun, aimed directly at his career. Hours earlier, Harris had been driving his patrol car through the high-end neighborhood of Crestwood, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The streets were lined with sleek, manicured lawns, driveways leading up to houses where money and privilege whispered through the walls. Place of order. A place where people like him ensured nothing disturbed the delicate balance. Then he saw her. A black woman, dressed in dark athletic wear, jogging down the sidewalk. Alone. At this hour? In this neighborhood? Something about it didn't sit right with him. His training had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts screamed that something was off. He pulled the car to the curb, flashing his lights. She stopped, one earbud still in, her face unreadable. Harris stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. Evening, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Can I see some ID? The woman arched a brow, tilting her head slightly. Why? Routine check. Got a few reports of suspicious activity in the area. Her lips twitched, not quite a smirk, but close. And I matched the description? Harris's jaw tightened. He didn't like her tone. Too calm, too confident. People usually stammered, fumbled for explanations, eager to prove they belonged. But she stood her ground, completely unfazed. You live around here, he pressed. She let out a quiet breath, her fingers adjusting the hem of her jacket. I do. Then you shouldn't have a problem proving it. The silence between them thickened as she studied him, her gaze slow and deliberate, like she was assessing not just his words, but the man beneath the uniform. Finally, she shook her head. I don't have ID on me. A lie, Harris was sure of it. Then you're coming with me, he said, reaching for his cuffs. The moment his hand touched her wrist, a ripple went through the air, like the world itself was holding its breath. And then it happened. The sharp clink of handcuffs locking into place. The collective gasp of the small crowd that had begun to gather. The blinding red of recording dots on multiple phone screens. And still, she didn't resist. Didn't argue. Just stood there, watching him with an unreadable expression. Until she spoke. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, detective. The words settled into his bones before he could even process them. And then slowly, methodically, she reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out her badge and raised it for him, an entire world to see. Chief Inspector Sierra Hall. Internal Affairs. Harris felt the ground shift beneath him. The handcuffs, still hanging from her wrist, suddenly felt like a noose tightening around his own throat. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone whispered, "Oh my God, she's IA." Another voice louder said, "He's screwed." And for the first time in his career, Harris felt something unfamiliar slither down his spine. Fear. Because in that moment, he knew, his life as he knew it was over. The echoes of the gathered crowd followed Harris as he tightened his grip on Sierra Hall's arm, guiding her toward his patrol car. His jaw was locked, his pulse hammering beneath his skin. The weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressed against his back, each one recording, judging, waiting for the inevitable fallout. But he wasn't thinking about that. Not yet. She let him move her, but not because she was afraid. That much was clear. She carried herself with an unnerving ease, her shoulders squared, her posture unyielding. Even with the cold bite of the cuffs against her wrists, she radiated control, as if she was the one arresting him. The back door of the patrol car swung open with a dull thud, and Harris nudged her inside, his movements more forceful than necessary. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she slid into the seat, the leather creaking under her weight. The doors slammed shut behind her, sealing them both in separate worlds. The outside roared with indignation, muffled voices demanding justice, phones raised like weapons against him. But inside the car, all was silent. Harris slid to the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. He exhaled sharply, staring straight ahead as he tried to process what had just happened. He had cuffed an internal affairs officer. Not just any officer, his new boss. The weight of realization pressed against his chest, thick and suffocating. He wanted to justify it, to convince himself that he had followed protocol, that she had been uncooperative, that he had done what any good cop would do. But the truth gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. She had given him every opportunity to back down. She had warned him. And yet he had pressed forward, blinded by the need to assert control. He cast a glance at the rearview mirror. Sierra sat there, unmoving, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, something sharper than anger, colder than disappointment. It was the look of a woman who had seen men like him before. And she had already decided his fate. The radio crackled to life, shattering the silence. Unit 4-2, we have reports of a disturbance at your location. Do you require assistance? Harris hesitated. He could still salvage this. Maybe if he explained the situation before anyone else did, he could control the narrative. Maybe. A voice cut through his thoughts. Not from the radio, but from the back seat. You should probably answer that. Her tone was level, almost bored, but it carried weight. A challenge wrapped in nonchalance. Harris exhaled through his nose, snatching up the radio. Negative. Situation is under control. Transporting suspect now. His own words felt foreign in his mouth, bitter and wrong. The moment he put the radio back, she spoke again. That was another mistake. Harris clenched his jaw. He refused to take the bait. Instead, he pulled onto the road, forcing his focus onto the drive. But the streetlights flickering across the windshield did nothing to distract him from the suffocating presence behind him. Sierra Hall, Chief Inspector of Internal Affairs. He knew the name now. And soon, so would everyone else. The drive to the precinct felt endless, every passing block stretching time into something unbearable. Harris could feel the tension clawing at his throat, the pressure building with every silent second. By the time he pulled into the parking lot, his pulse was a relentless drumbeat against his ribs. The station loomed ahead, a monolith of concrete and glass, its sterile glow casting shadows against the pavement. He killed the engine, gripping the wheel so tightly that his fingers ached. But he didn't move. From the back seat, Sierra exhaled softly. You're hesitating, she said. That's not like you. Harris finally turned, his gaze sharp. You don't know anything about me. For the first time, she smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips, like a predator baring its teeth. I know enough. Something in her voice sent a ripple of unease through him, something unsettlingly certain. But he shoved it aside. He had a job to do. With a sharp breath, he stepped out of the car, circling to the back door. When he opened it, she didn't resist, didn't flinch. She moved with that same controlled grace, rising to her feet as if the cuffs were nothing more than an inconvenience. The precinct doors yawned open before them, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Harris led her inside, his grip firm on her arm, though he already knew deep down that the roles had been reversed. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the air in the room shifted. Officers turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. A ripple of unease spread through the station as people registered what they were seeing. A detective bringing in a high-ranking internal affairs officer. In cuffs. Someone muttered a curse under their breath. Another officer, a rookie Harris barely knew, took an unconscious step back, as if afraid of being caught too close to whatever fallout was about to unfold. Then came the voice. Detective Harris. The room tensed. Captain Ben Kramer stood at the top of the steps leading to his office, his expression carved from stone. His gaze flickered from Harris to Sierra, taking in the scene with a slow, deliberate calculation. Bring her to my office. No. Harris swallowed hard. This wasn't going away. This wasn't going to be brushed under the rug. This was the beginning of something he couldn't stop. And as Sierra Hall walked past him, her cuffs still secured, her expression calm, he knew deep in the marrow of his bones. She had already won. Harris followed Sierra up the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The station was deathly silent, the kind of silence that only came when something catastrophic was unfolding. Officers moved aside as they passed, their eyes darting between the two of them, a mixture of disbelief, curiosity, and something else, something closer to fear. He had walked these halls 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with the weight of judgment pressing into his spine, never with the cold realization that every step forward was another nail in the coffin of his career. Kramer's office door loomed ahead, its frosted glass panel casting a dull reflection of the chaos behind them. Harris could see his own distorted silhouette, rigid, tense, and behind him, Sierra's, unnervingly composed. She moved like she was walking into a meeting she had been expecting, while Harris felt like he was marching toward a guillotine. Kramer pushed the door open without a word, stepping aside as Sierra entered first. Harris hesitated for a fraction of a second before following, feeling the air grow heavier the moment the door clicked shut behind them. The office was as impersonal as ever, gray walls, steel filing cabinets, a heavy wooden desk cluttered with paperwork. But tonight, it felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, suffocating in their simplicity. Kramer rounded the desk, his chair groaning under his weight as he sat. He leaned forward, his forearms resting against the surface, fingers laced together. His eyes, hard and unreadable, locked onto Harris with a kind of gaze that stripped a man down to his bones. For a moment, no one spoke. The air between them was thick, charged with the weight of what had just happened. Then, with deliberate control, Kramer exhaled. "Take off the cuffs." Harris's fingers twitched. His pulse spiked, an instinctive resistance flaring in his chest. But he knew better than to argue. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached for the key on his belt, stepping toward Sierra. She didn't move as the metal clicked open, her wrists finally free. Instead of rubbing at the reddened skin, she simply crossed her arms, her expression still unreadable. Kramer leaned back slightly, his chair creaking under the shift. He studied Sierra for a long moment before finally breaking the silence. "Chief Inspector Hall," he said, his tone carefully measured. "Would you like to explain what the hell just happened out there?" Sierra tilted her head slightly, as if considering how much of her answer should be a courtesy and how much a warning. When she spoke, her voice was as steady as ever. "I was detained under false pretenses, forcibly restrained, and publicly humiliated by one of your detectives." She turned her gaze toward Harris, her expression devoid of anger, yet somehow cutting all the same. "That detective, by the way, had no probable cause, no formal complaint to act on, and no justification for the arrest." Kramer's jaw tightened. Harris could see the barely contained frustration in the older man's face, the calculation flickering behind his eyes. Kramer wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what this meant. A wrongful detainment of a high-ranking internal affairs officer. A black woman, no less. The media would eat them alive. Harris opened his mouth, but Kramer cut him off with a sharp look. "I don't want to hear it," he snapped, his voice low but brimming with restrained fury. "Not yet." He turned his focus back to Sierra. "What are you expecting from this?" Sierra's eyes didn't waver. Accountability. A muscle in Kramer's jaw ticked. "You're IA," he said flatly. "You know how this works. If you take this public, you know exactly what kind of storm it's going to bring down on this department." Sierra didn't so much as blink. Then perhaps the department should be asking itself why a storm is necessary in the first place. The words landed like a slap. Harris felt his stomach knot. She wasn't backing down. Kramer sighed, dragging a hand down his face. "All right," he muttered. "What do you want?" For the first time since she stepped into the office, Sierra's lips curved into something resembling a smile. But there was no amusement in it, just quiet satisfaction. "First," she said smoothly, "I want the footage from every body cam at the scene tonight. Every angle, every second. And I want it untouched." Kramer nodded stiffly. "Second," she continued, "I want full transparency on whatever disciplinary action you take against Harris. No quiet warnings. No swept-under-the-rug meetings." Harris's stomach dropped, and then she turned to face him fully, her gaze sharp enough to cut. "Lastly," she said, her voice soft but lethal, "I want Detective Harris to personally explain, in front of the department, why he made the decisions he did tonight." Harris's throat went dry. He had seen men break under less. Kramer exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked at Harris, a silent question in his gaze. Harris clenched his fists at his sides, his nails biting into his palms. Every instinct in him screamed to push back, to fight, to defend himself. But there was no way out of this. Not with the entire station already whispering, not with the media likely getting wind of it as they spoke, and especially not with Sierra Hall standing before him, already knowing exactly how this would end. The words tasted like acid in his mouth. He swallowed. "I understand." Sierra's gaze held his for a beat longer before she turned back to Kramer. "Then we have an agreement." She stepped back, her posture relaxed, as if she had never been rattled by any of this. And maybe she hadn't. Maybe this had played out exactly as she expected it to. Kramer watched her for a long moment before finally nodding. I'll see to it. She inclined her head slightly, then turned toward the door. As she walked past Harris, she paused just long enough to lean in slightly. Your career didn't end tonight, detective, she murmured, low enough that only he could hear. But it just started dying. And with that, she was gone. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving only silence in her wake. Harris let out a slow breath, his fists unclenching at his sides. Kramer exhaled heavily, shaking his head before finally looking at him. You're an idiot, he muttered. And Harris had nothing to say in his defense. Harris sat in the interrogation room, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly, casting a sterile glow over the cold, gray walls. He had been in this room countless times before, but always on the other side of the table, always the one asking the questions. Tonight, the roles had shifted. He could feel it in the silence, in the weight of the air pressing down on him. Kramer had left him alone, telling him to sit tight while he handled the mess outside. That had been 20 minutes ago. The seconds crawled, stretching time into something unbearable. The room felt smaller with each passing moment, the walls creeping closer, as if waiting to swallow him whole. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. His career was hanging by a thread, and he knew it. Whatever was happening outside that door, whatever conversations were unfolding, whatever decisions were being made, he had no control over any of it. And that was the part that gnawed at him the most. Control. He had spent years building his reputation, climbing the ranks, making sure his authority was never questioned. Now, in the span of a single night, it was all unraveling. He thought back to the look in Sierra's eyes as she left Kramer's office, calm, measured, victorious. She had known exactly what she was doing, had played every move with precision. And he had walked straight into her trap, blind and arrogant. A sharp knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. It swung open, and Kramer stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He didn't sit, didn't offer Harris a seat at the table across from him. He simply stood there, arms crossed over his chest, his presence a quiet warning. You really screwed up, Kramer said, his voice devoid of sympathy. Harris stayed silent. What was there to say? Kramer let out a slow breath, shaking his head. IA is all over this now. The footage is being pulled, the reports are being filed, and you're about to be the face of everything that's wrong with this department. Harris bristled. I didn't. Stop. Kramer cut him off sharply. Just stop. I don't want your excuses. I don't want to hear about instincts or protocol or whatever bullshit you're telling yourself to justify this. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. You cuffed an internal affairs officer in front of half the damn city, Harris. Black woman. Do you have any idea what that looks like? Do you have any idea what's coming? Harris clenched his jaw, his fists tightening against his thighs. He did know. He just didn't want to admit it. Kramer straightened, pinching the bridge of his nose as if trying to will away the headache Harris had caused. The press already has the story, he continued. By morning, your face is going to be on every news channel, every website, every damn social media feed. There are protests being planned outside the station already. A cold sensation crawled up Harris's spine. Pros. This wasn't just a departmental issue anymore. It was turning into something bigger, something public. And once that happened, there was no containing it. Kramer exhaled, pacing the room slowly. I don't have a choice, he finally said. You're suspended, effective immediately. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Harris felt his chest tighten, his mind scrambling to process what he had just heard. Suspended. Not a warning. Not a write-up. A full suspension. His badge, his gun, his career, all slipping through his fingers. He forced himself to speak, though his voice was hoarse. For how long? Kramer's gaze was sharp, until further notice, which meant indefinitely, which meant this could be the beginning of the end. Silence settled between them. Harris wanted to fight it, wanted to push back, to argue that he had been doing his job. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Not now. Not with how fast this was spiraling out of control. Kramer finally stepped back toward the door, pausing just before opening it. Hand over your badge and weapon before you leave, he said. And Harris looked up. Kramer's expression was unreadable, but his next words carried weight. If I were you, I'd start thinking about what comes next. Because I don't think you're walking away from this unscathed. And with that, he was gone. The door clicked shut, leaving Harris alone once more. He sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space Kramer had just occupied. His hands felt numb, his pulse a dull thud in his ears. His career, his entire life, was slipping away, and for the first time in a long time, he had no idea what to do. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stood. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each step required conscious effort. He reached down, unclipping his badge from his belt, letting it rest heavy in his palm. The metal was cool, smooth, a symbol of everything he had worked for. With one last glance at it, he set it down on the table. Then he unholstered his gun, feeling the weight of it one final time before placing it beside the badge. He stepped back, looking at the two objects, once extensions of himself, now nothing more than discarded pieces of his past. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. As he stepped into the main hall, he could feel the eyes on him. Officers whispering, heads turning, some watching with poorly hidden satisfaction, others with quiet pity. He didn't stop, didn't acknowledge them. He just kept walking. Out of the station, out into a night that suddenly felt colder than it had before. And as the city lights stretched before him, blurring into the horizon, one thought echoed in his mind. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Harris sat alone in his apartment, the dim glow of the television flickering across the walls. The sound was muted, but he didn't need to hear it to know what was being said. Every major news outlet was running the same footage. The moment he had cuffed Sierra Hall, the stunned reactions of the bystanders, the burning intensity in her gaze as she revealed her badge. His name was everywhere. His face, frozen in the act of detaining the wrong person at the worst possible time, was plastered across every screen. His phone sat on the table in front of him, vibrating intermittently. Calls, texts, emails, none of which he wanted to see. He had ignored the first few, then turned off notifications entirely. The silence was preferable to whatever the world had to say about him. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He had spent his entire career believing in one thing: control. Over a scene, over a suspect, over the narrative. And now, for the first time, control had been ripped from his hands, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. A knock at the door cut through the thick silence of the room. He didn't move at first, staring at the door like it might simply go away. But the knock came again, heavier this time. With a sigh, he pushed himself up and crossed the room. He knew who it would be before he even turned the handle. Sam Carter stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He was still in uniform, though his tie was loosened and his sleeves were pushed up to his elbows. Harris didn't step aside. "You gonna invite me in?" Sam asked, his voice even. Harris considered it for a second before finally stepping back. Sam entered without another word, his gaze sweeping the apartment. It was a mess, half-empty beer bottles on the counter, a discarded jacket over the back of the couch. Harris had never been the type to let things fall into disarray, but in the span of 24 hours, his world had shifted so violently that he hadn't been able to bring himself to care. Sam didn't comment on it. Instead, he turned, arms crossed. "Kramer told me," he said. "You're officially off the force. Suspension pending review." Harris let out a dry laugh. "Pending review," he echoed. What a joke. Sam was quiet for a moment. "You screwed up, man." The words stung more than Harris expected them to. He had prepared himself for anger, for accusations, but the simple, straightforward honesty of it was worse. Harris shook his head, pacing toward the counter. "I was doing my job, Sam. Were you?" The question hung in the air between them. Harris clenched his jaw. "You think I'm a racist now, too?" he asked, his voice bitter. Sam exhaled slowly. "I think you let your instincts make a decision before your brain could catch up. And now you're paying the price for it." Harris ran a hand through his hair. "This whole thing is a circus," he muttered. "The media, the protests, they don't know me. They don't know what I stand for." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you put cuffs on the wrong person in front of an entire crowd." Harris turned sharply. She didn't have ID. Sam gave him a long, measured look. "And you really think that was the reason you stopped her?" A tense silence stretched between them. Harris didn't have an answer. Because deep down, beneath the frustration and resentment, beneath the instinct to defend himself, a sliver of doubt had begun to take root. Had he stopped her because something about the situation felt off? Or had he stopped her because, for a split second, he had assumed she didn't belong there? Sam sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Look, I didn't come here to argue. I came because I wanted you to hear it from me, before you hear it from everyone else. Harris frowned. Hear what? Sam hesitated, then pulled out his phone. A few taps later, he turned the screen toward Harris. It was a social media post. The headline alone made Harris's stomach drop. Disgraced Officer Harris under investigation for pattern of racial profiling. Below it were multiple reports, anonymous accounts from people who claimed to have had run-ins with him in the past. Each one accused him of stopping them for no reason, of unnecessary force, of thinly veiled intimidation tactics. The comments below were a firestorm of anger, demands for his permanent removal from the force, calls for criminal charges. Harris's hands curled into fists. This is bullshit. Sam didn't look away. Maybe some of it is. Maybe it's not. Harris shot him a glare. You're really going to stand there and tell me you believe this? I'm telling you that this is bigger than one incident, Sam said. You think the department is going to go out of its way to protect you now? With this kind of pressure? With a woman like Sierra Hall making sure this doesn't get buried? Harris's stomach twisted. Because Sam was right. This wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It was about the entire system, about public perception, about whether the department would see him as a liability rather than a man worth defending. And right now, he was losing. Sam pocketed his phone. Look, I don't know how this ends for you, he admitted. But if you want to get ahead of it, you need to stop acting like the victim. Start figuring out what comes next. Harris didn't respond. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure there was a next. As Sam headed for the door, he paused just before opening it. You might not think so now, he said, but she did you a favor. If it wasn't her, it would have been someone else. At least this way, you still have a shot at getting out of this with something left. And then he was gone. Harris stood in the silence that followed, staring at the closed door, at the shadows stretching across the walls. Sierra Hall had set something in motion that he couldn't stop. And for the first time, he was starting to realize. She wasn't just an obstacle. She was the reckoning he had never seen coming. Harris had spent his entire career believing he understood how the world worked. There were rules, and those rules were upheld by men like him, men who enforced order, who kept the chaos at bay. But now, as he sat alone in his darkened apartment, staring at the headlines that branded him a villain, he wondered if he had ever truly understood anything at all. The city outside his window was alive with unrest. The glow of streetlights barely pierced the fog rolling in from the bay, and somewhere in the distance, the low murmur of a restless crowd carried through the air. The protest had started almost immediately, a swelling wave of voices demanding accountability. Some held signs with his name, others chanted slogans about corruption and systemic failure. It wasn't just about him. It never had been. He had become a symbol, a name attached to something far greater than himself. And that was the part he couldn't stomach. He wasn't corrupt. He wasn't a monster. He had spent years in this uniform, risking his life, doing what he thought was right. He had followed the rules. So why did it feel like the entire world had turned against him? His eyes drifted back to the television screen, where a news anchor was replaying the footage for the 100th time. He knew every frame by now. The moment he grabbed Sierra Hall's wrist, the click of the cuffs, the hush that fell over the crowd when she revealed her badge. He had watched it so many times that the scene no longer felt real. It was just an image now, something frozen in time, forever burned into the public's memory. The phone on his table buzzed again, another notification flashing across the screen. He didn't need to check it to know what it was. More outrage. More threats. More proof that his life, as he had known it, was over. And yet, through all the noise, one thought gnawed at the back of his mind. Sierra Hall had played him. She had known exactly what would happen the second he stopped her. She had known that the cameras would catch everything, that the media would eat it up, that the department would be forced to throw him to the wolves to save themselves. She had orchestrated this, set the pieces in motion, and watched as he destroyed himself, step by step. But why? Was this personal? Or was he just another name on a list of men who had to fall for the system to change? He pushed himself up from the couch, pacing the length of his apartment. He needed answers. He needed to understand what game he had been pulled into. And there was only one person who could give them to him. The Bureau of Internal Affairs operated out of a sleek, glass-covered building downtown. It was nothing like the precinct Harris had spent his career in. No peeling paint, no buzzing fluorescent lights, no exhausted officers slumped over desks. Everything here was pristine, cold, efficient. It felt less like a law enforcement office and more like the headquarters of a corporate empire. Harris had expected to be stopped at the entrance, but the security guard barely looked at him before letting him through. That was his first warning sign. They had been expecting him. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, save for the soft chime as the doors slid open. The hallway stretched out before him, empty and impossibly quiet. At the end of it, a single door stood ajar, the faint glow of a desk lamp spilling into the corridor. She was waiting for him. Sierra sat behind her desk, her posture relaxed, one hand resting on the edge of a folder. She didn't look surprised to see him. If anything, she looked amused. "You came faster than I expected," she said, not bothering to look up. Harris stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. He didn't sit. "You set me up," he said, his voice flat. She finally lifted her gaze, dark eyes meeting his without hesitation. "Did I? You knew exactly what would happen that night. You baited me into making a mistake." Sierra leaned back slightly, tilting her head as if considering his words. "I didn't force you to put cuffs on me," she said. "I didn't make you escalate the situation. That was all you." Harris's jaw clenched. "You could have just shown me your badge. And you could have asked for it before assuming I didn't belong." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, Harris felt the full weight of what had happened, not just the consequences, but the root of it all. He had assumed. Without evidence, without cause, he had assumed she didn't belong in that neighborhood. And because of that assumption, his career had unraveled in a matter of seconds. Sierra studied him, and for the first time, there was no amusement in her gaze. Only scrutiny. "You're angry," she observed. "But I don't think you know who you're angry at." He didn't answer. Because she was right. Was he angry at her? At himself? At the system that had taught him to trust his instincts, only to punish him when those instincts led him to the wrong conclusion? Sierra exhaled, setting the folder aside. "You came here looking for someone to blame," she said. "But here's the truth, you were always going to end up here. Maybe not tonight, maybe not with me, but eventually. Because this isn't about me, Harris." It never was. He wanted to argue, wanted to push back. But for the first time, he had no words. Because deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent years believing he was one of the good ones, that he was different. And yet, when the moment came, he had acted just like every other cop who had made the news for the wrong reasons. Sierra leaned forward slightly. "So what now?" she asked. "You going to spend the rest of your life being bitter? Or are you going to do something about it?" Harris let out a slow breath. For the first time, he had no idea how to answer. Harris had spent years believing in a version of himself that no longer existed. He had built his career on the foundation that he was one of the good ones, a cop who followed the rules, who protected people, who upheld the law with integrity. But as he stood in Sierra Hall's office, the cold truth settled into his bones. That belief had been nothing more than an illusion. She had torn it down, not with rage or accusations, but with something much worse, calm certainty. The kind that came from years of watching men like him make the same mistakes, clinging to the idea that their authority made them immune to scrutiny. For the first time in his life, Harris didn't know what to do next. He left the Bureau of Internal Affairs without another word, stepping onto the quiet city streets. The cool night air hit his face, but it did nothing to clear the fog in his mind. He kept walking, past the glowing windows of late-night diners, past the hushed murmurs of people on their way home. Every so often, he caught glimpses of his own face staring back at him from newsstands and television screens inside bars. His name had become a spectacle, his career reduced to a viral moment that would outlive him. A part of him wanted to fight back, to prove that he wasn't the man they said he was. But another part, the part that had sat across from Sierra and felt the weight of her words, knew that proving them wrong wouldn't be as simple as denying what had happened. Harris walked until his feet ached, his thoughts circling the same question over and over. What now? By the time he reached his apartment, exhaustion had settled deep in his limbs. He unlocked the door, stepping into the silence of a space that no longer felt like home. The TV was still on, the volume low, flickering with news coverage of the protests outside the precinct. The footage cut between clips of people chanting his name in outrage and officers standing behind barricades, their expressions impassive. He turned away from the screen, pouring himself a drink at the kitchen counter. The whiskey burned on the way down, but it did nothing to dull the unease twisting in his gut. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, expecting another flood of notifications, but the name on the screen made him pause. Sam Carter. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. He wasn't in the mood for another lecture, another reminder of what he had lost. But something in him, maybe guilt, maybe something else, made him pick up. Yeah, he answered, his voice hoarse. You need to get down here, Sam's voice came through, tense and urgent. Harris frowned. Where? The precinct. Harris felt a sharp pang of something between disbelief and irritation. In case you forgot, I'm not exactly welcome there anymore. Yeah, well, that doesn't matter right now. There was a pause, then Sam's voice dropped, lower and more serious. Something's happening. You need to see it for yourself. Harris hesitated. He had spent all night avoiding that place, avoiding the fallout. But something in Sam's tone made him uneasy. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. The streets near the precinct were a mess of flashing lights and restless movement. Protesters lined the sidewalks, their voices rising in unison, demanding justice. Harris kept his head down as he approached, weaving through the crowd. He could feel the tension in the air, palpable, electric, ready to ignite at any moment. When he reached the barricades, Sam was waiting. His face was tight, his posture tense. He jerked his head toward the far end of the street. Look at that, he said. Harris followed his gaze. Across the street, a group of men stood together, their faces partially obscured by the shadows cast from the streetlights. They weren't part of the protest. Their clothes were too plain, their stance too controlled. Harris recognized the type immediately, cops in plainclothes. Watching, waiting. What are they doing? Harris asked. Sam's jaw tightened. Looking for a reason. Harris understood immediately. The department was bracing itself for escalation. They weren't just standing by. They were preparing to shut this down by force if necessary. The realization sent a chill through him. He had seen situations like this before. He had been on the other side of them. And he knew exactly how quickly things could spiral out of control. Harris turned back to Sam. Who's in charge of the response? Kramer. Harris clenched his fists. He should have known. Sierra knows about this, he asked. Sam nodded. She's inside, talking to the brass, trying to stop it before it gets ugly. Harris exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure why he had come here. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was guilt. But standing here now, seeing the way things were unfolding, he realized something. For the first time since this started, he had a choice. He could walk away, let the night play out the way it was going to. It wasn't his problem anymore. Or he could do something. He wasn't sure if it would matter. He wasn't even sure if it would make a difference. But he knew one thing. He had spent his entire career thinking he was on the right side of things. Tonight, he had the chance to prove it. Without another word, Harris pushed forward, slipping past the barricades and heading toward the precinct doors. He didn't know what was waiting for him inside, but he was about to find out. The moment Harris stepped inside the precinct, the energy in the room shifted. The tension was thick, stretching across the space like an invisible wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Officers moved through the building with tightly coiled precision, their gazes flicking toward him before quickly looking away. He could feel the weight of their unspoken judgment, the whispers that followed in his wake. He was no longer one of them. Ahead, in the middle of the main hall, Kramer stood with a group of senior officers, their voices low but urgent. The radio on Kramer's hip crackled intermittently with updates from outside. The protest was growing, the crowd pressing closer to the barricades. Every few minutes, another call came in requesting guidance. But the man Harris was looking for wasn't Kramer. Sierra Hall stood near the back of the room, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Even in the midst of the growing chaos, she looked composed, as if none of this had the power to shake her. But Harris had seen enough tonight to know that wasn't true. She wasn't just here as a spectator. She was fighting a battle, one he wasn't sure she could win. She noticed him immediately, though she didn't move at first. She simply watched, waiting. Harris crossed the room, ignoring the officers who shot him wary glances. "You shouldn't be here," Sierra said when he was close enough to hear her over the noise of the precinct. "I could say the same to you," he replied. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Except I actually belong here." The words were a quiet, razor-sharp reminder of everything that had brought them to this point. Harris exhaled through his nose, keeping his voice level. "Then tell me what's happening." Sierra studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not he was worth the effort. Then, with a small nod, she spoke. "The department is on edge. The crowd outside keeps growing, and Kramer is preparing to move in before things get out of control." Harris glanced toward the cluster of officers near the entrance. "And what's your plan?" "I already convinced the mayor's office to hold back the riot squad," she said. "But Kramer still has authority over his own men. If he decides to escalate, there won't be much stopping him." Harris frowned. "You think he wants this to turn into a full-blown riot?" "I think he wants to send a message," Sierra replied, her voice calm but pointed, "that no matter how much public pressure there is, the department still calls the shots." Harris felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He had been part of this world for so long that he had stopped questioning the way things worked. Protests weren't just about the people in the streets. They were about power, about who got to dictate the rules. And right now, Kramer was making sure the city knew the department wasn't backing down. But Harris also knew something else. Things didn't need to escalate unless someone gave the order. He turned back to Sierra. "You have proof that he's planning to push the situation?" "I don't need proof," she said. "I just know how men like him think." Harris wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Because deep down, he knew it too. Outside, the sound of the protest swelled, voices rising in unison, echoing through the streets. Then came the unmistakable crack of a baton against metal. Dull thud. A warning. Sierra's posture stiffened. Harris's gut clenched. He turned toward the entrance just as one of the younger officers rushed inside, his face pale. "They're moving in," the officer announced, breathless. "Kramer just gave the order." The room erupted into motion. Officers hurried toward the doors, some securing riot gear, others grabbing radios to relay orders. Sierra muttered something under her breath before pushing past Harris. For a split second, he hesitated. Then he followed her. Outside, the scene had changed. Where before there had been a restless but mostly contained crowd, now there was movement. Officers pushing forward, forming a barrier, the front lines of the protest shifting as people reacted. Some raised their hands. Others held their phones high, capturing every second. The air was thick with the kind of anticipation that could break in an instant. And at the center of it all stood Kramer. He was near the barricades, his stance wide, his voice calm but firm as he barked orders to the officers flanking him. They were in formation now, waiting for his next move. Harris knew this strategy. He had seen it play out before. The longer the tension held, the more likely it was that someone on either side would make a mistake. And once that happened, there was no going back. Sierra moved fast, stepping directly into Kramer's path before he could signal his men forward. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. Kramer barely spared her a glance. "Hall, this isn't your call. I have orders from the mayor to hold back riot control." Kramer exhaled sharply. "And I have a situation that's about to turn violent if we don't take control." Sierra shook her head. "The only violence that's going to happen is the kind you initiate." Harris watched as Kramer's jaw clenched. For a second, it looked like he might stand down. But then one of the officers shifted, too quick, too aggressive, and the front row of the crowd reacted. A bottle flew through the air, smashing against the pavement near the barricades. That was all it took. Kramer lifted his hand, a silent order. The officers moved, but Harris was already stepping forward. "Stand down," he called, his voice cutting through the commotion. Several officers hesitated. Kramer turned, his expression darkening. "Harris, you don't get to." "This isn't control," Harris interrupted, his voice steady despite the chaos. "You know how this ends." For the first time since this all began, Harris wasn't looking at Kramer as his superior. He was looking at him as a man about to make a decision he couldn't take back. Kramer's hand hovered in the air. His men waited. The next move belonged to him. And in that second, Harris wasn't sure which way it would go. The moment stretched impossibly long. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the decision hanging over everyone's shoulders. Harris could see it, the officers gripping their batons tighter, their muscles coiled and ready, the protesters standing firm but bracing for what they knew was coming. The night had reached its breaking point. One wrong move, one misstep, and the city would descend into chaos. Kramer's hand was still poised in the air, his authority hanging on the edge of a single command. He had made up his mind, but for the first time, Harris saw hesitation in his stance. He was a man who had spent years asserting control, and now that control was slipping away. The line between order and disaster had never been thinner. Harris didn't wait. He stepped closer, his voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. "You think this is going to end with you in control?" His tone wasn't pleading, wasn't desperate. It was calculated, steady, laced with something dangerous. "This isn't just another night, Kramer. This is the moment that defines everything." Kramer's eyes flicked to him, cold and unyielding. "You don't give that order," Harris continued, "and you get to keep some of that power you're clinging to. But you send them in, and you lose everything. Your badge, your rank, your reputation, it's all gone." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the crowd seemed to hold its breath. Sierra stood off to the side, watching, waiting. Harris didn't need to look at her to know what she was thinking. She had played her hand, and now it was his move. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, Kramer lowered his hand. A ripple of confusion passed through the officers behind him. Some hesitated, shifting their weight, unsure of what to do without a direct command. The tension remained, thick and suffocating, but the moment of explosion had passed. Harris let out a slow breath, feeling his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Kramer turned to face him fully, his expression unreadable. The noise of the crowd had started again, murmurs and hushed voices wondering what would happen next. "You don't get to walk away from this clean," Kramer said finally, his voice low enough that only Harris could hear. "This doesn't make you a hero." Harris met his gaze without flinching. "I don't need to be a hero. I just need to be right." A muscle in Kramer's jaw twitched, but he said nothing else. Instead, he turned sharply, gesturing to the officers around him. "Stand down," he barked, his voice clipped and controlled. It was over. The officers began retreating, stepping back from the barricades. The protesters, still wary, didn't cheer, didn't move. They had seen this before, had seen moments of restraint followed by betrayal. No one was celebrating yet. Sierra stepped up beside Harris, her eyes still locked on Kramer as he walked away. "You just bought them time," she said. "But it's not over." "I know," Harris murmured. He turned back toward the crowd, toward the faces that were still watching him, still waiting to see what would come next. He had spent his entire career believing he understood power, believing he was the one who maintained balance in the city. Tonight, he realized how wrong he had been. Power wasn't about control. It was about choices. And tonight, for the first time in his life, he had made the right one. The news broke within the hour. Harris watched from his apartment the same way he had watched every headline about himself over the last few days. Except this time, it wasn't about him being the villain. This time, the focus was on what hadn't happened, on the riot that hadn't broken out, on the officers who had been called back instead of let loose. Some news stations painted it as a victory, proof that the system could work. Others called it a momentary pause in a much larger battle. Harris knew the truth. This wasn't a victory. It was a single moment in a war that had been raging long before he ever put on a badge. And it would continue long after he was gone. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. He hesitated before answering, but when he swung the door open, he wasn't surprised to see Sierra standing there. She didn't speak at first, just studied him, as if she were still trying to figure out who he really was. Finally, she sighed. "So what now?" Harris exhaled, leaning against the doorframe. "I don't know." And for the first time in a long time, he was okay with that. Because the next move, where he went from here, what he became, was finally his to make.